everybody. Back with some more information about Mary Magdalene, one of the women who encountered Jesus. And so I remember the last session we were talking about Mary was very, very passionate in her devotion to Jesus because he had healed her from 7 demons. We talked about the fact that she's never painted as a sinful woman, but rather an afflicted woman. And she's also must have been a fairly important person because every time she's mentioned in the Bible, she's at the head of the list of women. And it's almost like she was a leader of the group. Or maybe because she had been healed of much, she was really passionate about her devotion to the Lord. The next time we see Mary, after those mentions of her earlier in the book of Luke, the next time we see Mary is at the crucifixion. And of course, we have different events that lead up to the crucifixion. There is the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the arrest of Jesus. He goes before Annas, the high priest, and Caiaphas. Then he's taken to Pilate, who's a Roman official. And Pilate, of course, questions him and offers the crowd the chance to release Barabbas instead of Jesus, and the crowd yells, "Crucify him." The Bible says there was a lot of high priests stirring up the crowd, trying to get them to yell, "Crucify him, crucify him." And so he was led off to be crucified. He was mocked by the soldiers and carried the cross to Calvary, and then obviously nailed on the cross. Okay, so Mary Magdalene is not mentioned by name through all of that up until the actual cross. We have to believe, at least I do, if she was at the cross, she may have been at some of these other events. She may have been following him up the road to Calvary. She may have been in the crowd. She may have been in the crowd that yelled, "Crucify him, crucify him." These must have been horrible, a horrible turn of events, like a mob scene for the disciples of Jesus, for anyone who was a believer. Because here's the master that they followed all this time, and now the crowd has turned on him. It wasn't that long ago, they were laying palm branches down and welcoming him into the city. And now all of a sudden, that mob mentality has become, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And of course, Jesus doesn't say much at all. So he's not defending himself. And it probably was very frustrating and very, just a horrible sensation for anyone who was a disciple of his. And so I'm assuming Mary Magdalene must have been there somewhere along that path because she ends up at the cross. And that's really where we hear her name being mentioned first. And this would be in, let's see, John 19, verse 25. So let's go there first. I think I have that here. All 4 Gospels talk about all the events that lead up to the cross. Some of them mention all those events that I just mentioned. Some of them leave one out or another one out, but they all eventually end up at the cross. And of the 4 Gospels, 2 of them mention Mary Magdalene being at the cross. The first one is John 19, verse 25. It's when the soldiers are dividing their clothes, his clothes. They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. So this is what the soldiers did. Now verse 25. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother, his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Again, we went through all the Marys. There's 3 Marys there, okay? So it's kind of confusing sometimes. There's Mary, the mother of Jesus, is standing there watching her son be crucified. What could be worse than that? I can't even imagine how her heart is breaking, or how terrified and horrified she is, and how desolate that feeling. And then Mary, the wife of Clopas, again, we're pretty sure Clopas might be Joseph's brother, so this would be Mary's sister-in-law. In other words, family is there with her. And who else is there with her? Mary Magdalene. Those three are mentioned. There were lots of other women at the cross, but in John's gospel, he mentions those three specifically. Why? It's obvious that Mary, the mother of Jesus, would be mentioned because this is her son, okay? And Mary, the wife of Clopas, she's there to support her sister-in-law. Why Mary Magdalene? She must have been close. She must have been close to Jesus, but also close to the other women. This was a band of women who had been together throughout Jesus' ministry. And so she was a very important woman for her to be mentioned at the crucifixion. Think about it. Who else is mentioned that they're there? John is mentioned because it says when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that time on, this disciple took her into his home. The disciple that Jesus loved was John. He refers to himself that way as he's writing this gospel. So John is mentioned, but I don't hear any names of any other disciples mentioned in this account. I'm sure they were all there. This would have been an unbelievable tragedy, and they would not have been able to stay away, I'm sure. Maybe they were even praying that something would happen to intervene to stop this horrible thing from happening. And I'm sure Mary Magdalene was there also to support the other women. Among them, Jesus' mother and sister-in-law. So that is the first gospel writer that I found who mentions Mary Magdalene at the cross. But Mark also mentions her, and that is in Mark 15, and it starts with verse 6. If we go on, verse 6 is all about being offered Barnabas, that the people did not want Barnabas to be released, and the crowd came up and he asked them, "Do you want me to release you, the king of the Jews?" Said Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interests that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. So Pilate knows, he knows what's going on here. He knows these chief priests do not want someone as powerful as Jesus around. They want to get rid of him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. So they were instigators all through the crowd. "What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. I just can't imagine if Mary Magdalene were there, listening to all these people screaming and yelling and watching the chief priests go around and instigate people against Jesus. It just must have been tearing her heart out. The next part of this goes through the soldiers mocking Jesus, putting a purple robe on him and, putting a crown of thorns and so on. And then they led him out. It was in verse 25, after they divide up his clothes and cast lots, that Mark mentions Mary Magdalene. Okay. And, oh, I apologize. I thought it was verse 25, but I guess it wasn't. Oh, that was John. Okay, so let's go down a little ways further and see if I can find it. Oh, here it is. Okay, verse 40. I apologize. This is after the curtain was torn in two from top to bottom, and Jesus has actually breathed his last. And the centurion who was in front of Jesus saw that he had died and said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." So right at the end of all of these facts of crucifixion that Mark has put down, he writes this: "Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there." So Mark notes right at the end, right when Jesus died, that standing close by, watching the whole thing, was a crowd of women. And he does not mention Jesus' mother, but he mentions specifically 3 women amongst this group that was there. First, he mentions Mary Magdalene, then Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and that is the same person as Mary Clopas, and Salome. Remember, I told you sometimes Salome is called Mary Salome. And look what he adds. It's interesting. Here he's just pronounced Jesus dead. He hasn't even in the tomb yet. And look what he writes about these women. In Galilee, these women followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. So here, this is not just a few women. This is a whole group of women. And the first one mentioned is Mary Magdalene, as though she was kind of the leader of the group. And what they did for him in Galilee, what they had done for Jesus, was follow him and care for his needs. So follow him meaning they were disciples, they were believers, they were following his teachings, and they were part of the new church that was going to be formed based on Jesus as the Messiah. And beyond that, they were caring for his physical needs. They were making sure there was food, they were contributing to their resources to whatever was needed. Okay, so I think it's interesting that that's in the gospel account of the cross, because he's writing the most important details here of the entire culmination of Jesus' ministry, and he includes the women. They must have been an integral part of this whole process, of Jesus' whole ministry. They had to have been, or he wouldn't have mentioned them right at the cross. He could have mentioned them, anywhere along the gospel account. But here, it's almost like in his mind's eye, he's seeing them. Oh, and there was also that group of women there, and how they cared for him, and how they followed him, and how they must have been heartbroken. I can't imagine. I just can't even imagine being at the cross. It's when Jesus dies, it must have seemed like the death of everything for them. Everything they believed in. Particularly for Mary Magdalene, who said, he healed me of all of these 7 demons, and yet he can't come down off the cross. He can't save himself. Confused, I'm sure. None of the people who followed Jesus truly understood his mission of dying. They thought of it as an earthly mission, or they thought there would be some way that he would be able to circumvent what was the plan. But God had the plan that one perfect man, Jesus, would die for the sins of everyone. And that is something that none of them, even though they were told over and over, None of them truly grasped it until after Jesus' resurrection, when then it became clear to them. And then they eventually were visited by the Holy Spirit, and everything fell into place for them at that point. But here, there must have been a lot of confusion along with the terror. So I do believe Mary Magdalene is turning out to be quite an important woman in Jesus' ministry. She's at the cross. And aren't we all? Aren't we all, in a way? It's like that old song that, for those tears I died. I'm right there. My sin is right there being nailed to the cross, along with yours and Mary's and everybody else's. So we can kind of put our own hearts into Mary Magdalene at this point and feel the emotions she would have been feeling at that point. We're going to leave Mary there today and go on and see the other areas and other times in this story that she's mentioned, and there are more. Because don't forget, she's mentioned 12 to 14 times through the Gospels, which is more than a lot of men are mentioned. So I like that. I think it's great. It really shows us that women were close to Jesus' heart and had a place in his ministry. And we still do. And we still do. So have a blessed day.